International Relations from the University of Peshawar, and I will be our moderator for this session. So session 3 and 4 of the program pertain to the Indonesian economy. We basically went over its development, its challenges and opportunities, and just its various nuances. So this is part 2 of the same topic. The previous session was on surviving turbulent multidimensional crisis, whereas the particular agenda topic of today's session is the role of central bank in maintaining financial stability during the crisis. So for that, we have a panel of 3 speakers today, Dr. Ahmad, Dr. Sajjad, and Mr. Suleiman. So from the Indonesian end, we have Dr. Ahmad Akbar Susamto. I hope I am saying that right. Just to give a brief profile of our Indonesian speaker, he is joining us from the University of Gadjah Mada. He is a permanent lecturer at the Department of Economics and also the head of the master's program in development economics there. Apart from that, he is also an economist of core Indonesia. He did his bachelor's in economics and development from the University of Gadjah Mada, and he did his master's from am I audible? Hello? Yeah, sorry, I keep having technical issues. So yeah, while he did his master's in economics from Monash University. Previously, he's also been chairman of the Center for Islamic Economics and Business Studies, as well as the acting head of doctoral program in Islamic Economics and Halal Industry, also at the University of Gadjah Mada. So sir, you have the floor. You may now give your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aisyah. How many minutes do I have?
Usually 1 hour, Pak.
Oh, usually 1 hour. Okay, thank you very much.
45 minutes and then followed with the Q&A.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Aisyah, as the chair of this session, and thank you very much for everyone who are attending this session. I'm very happy to be here today. My name is Akbar, or you can call me also Ahmad, and I'll be sharing a little bit about more recent update of the Indonesian economy, surviving from turbulent multidimensional crisis. Well, I think you have met Pak Faisal yesterday, Mr. Faisal yesterday, and he is a colleague of mine, and we have agreed to share our topic. So in a way that as we can avoid some kind of overlap between us, hopefully. All right. There are some technical terms that I will use in these topics. I will talk about economic growth in most cases. So I will start with this one, assuming that you come from different disciplines. So what is economic growth? I will talk about this later, actually. So economic growth shows the percentage change in the value of real gross domestic product from period to period, right? And then what is GDP, or gross domestic product? So basically it is the total market value of all final goods and services produced in a particular area within a given period. So just very brief, hopefully can help you, especially those who come from disciplines other than economics. But now I will talk about the economy of Indonesia. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, let me start with this graph, this simple graph showing about Indonesian economy over the last 3 decades, from 1990 to 2020. So over the last 3 decades, Indonesia has experienced a relatively stable economic growth rate over the last 3 decades. As I mentioned before, economic growth rate is the percentage change in the real GDP, real gross domestic product. So exceptions are the economic growth rate during the 1997 financial crisis and the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. So what we have here, so in general, over the last 2 decades, from 2000 or so to 2020, at least before the COVID-19 pandemic, we tend to have an economic growth rate around 5%. Not always 5%, of course, but around 5%. Sometimes it is just a little bit upper, sometimes it is lower, but relatively around 5%. As I mentioned before, exceptions are here. Exceptions are when we have a very low economic growth rate during the 1997 financial crisis here. So we experienced a deep recession here in 1998, and then here during the current COVID-19 pandemic. In 2008, when many countries experienced a lower economic growth rate due to the global economic crisis at the time, Indonesia still survived. Indonesia survived the crisis at the time, and you can see here our economic growth rate was relatively still, well, it is not that good, but it is also still not far from the average rate around 5%. So that's what happens in the last 30 years. But you can see as well, and also by Faisal, Mr. Faisal has also mentioned in the previous session that in general, our economic growth here, despite its stable economic growth rate, but the rate here is relatively lower than the rate that we achieved during the 1990s. Yeah, during the 1990s, Indonesia experienced very high economic growth rate, around 7% on average annually, and at the time, Indonesia was given the title New Asian Tiger, something like that. Before we experienced the crisis here, but now after 2000 up to now, the economic growth rate, despite its stability, it tends to be a bit lower, just around 5%. All right. So as we grow around 5% annually, then we experience an increase in our GDP per capita. So what is GDP per capita? GDP per capita is a measure of economic welfare. So talking about GDP is just like pizza. If I go back to this point, the GDP is like pizza. So it is the total product that you can produce. Yeah, the value of the total product that you produce within a year. Yeah, in Indonesia, in a certain area, say Indonesia. And then what is GDP per capita? GDP per capita is basically the GDP divided by the number of population. So basically, it is just like the slice of pizza per person, assuming that the GDP is divided equally for everyone. Of course, in real life, it is not equal. But assuming that the GDP is divided equally for everyone, then we can have the slice of pizza per person like this. So this is the GDP per capita. And as you can see here, as we grow at around 5% over the last 2 decades, and as our economy grows at around 5% every year, while at the same time our population growth rate is just around 1.25% a year, then our GDP per capita increase as well. Yeah. Of course, it is not that smooth. Sometimes it's experienced here during the 1998 crisis. Again, our GDP per capita dropped very sharply. But then after that, the growth rate has been relatively stable. And then, so in general, our GDP per capita increased relatively. And if you look at here, so our current GDP per capita is more than triple than what we have like 30 years ago. So of course, it is a sign that people in Indonesia now is, okay, just to say in a simple word, three times better off than the last 30 years, than the one at 30 years ago. If you look at the, if you go to the areas of Indonesia, different provinces in Indonesia, then you will see the sign as well. So like 30 years ago, not so many people have cars, not so many people have even motorbikes at the time. Rich people have only some bicycles. Whereas now, the number of people using bicycles as their primary transportation facility, as their transportation vehicle is less. I'm not mentioning about those using bicycles for sport. I'm talking about those who use the bicycles as their primary transportation vehicles. Now, most people use cars. Most people use the motorbikes. just giving the sign that we have experienced an increase in our economic welfare in general. Well, of course, not everyone. When we are talking about the economy, then of course, once again, there will be some kind of inequality. Some people are rich, even super rich. Sometimes we call it crazy rich. Some other people are poor. But in general, we have experienced an improvement in our economic welfare. Well, of course, this kind of improvement does not only happen in Indonesia. It happens in many other countries as well, and I think also in Pakistan. But okay, let me go back to Indonesia. So this is what happens in the last 30 years or so. Within this story, then we can look at the economy in a little bit more detail. As I mentioned, we experience a relatively stable economic growth rate. But despite a convincing progress, during the last decade of the 20th century, despite the convincing progress in our economy, Indonesia actually has experienced what's so-called premature deindustrialization. So what I mean is this. So when you talk about the gross domestic product, when you talk about the pizza that they produce in each year, then you can look at the pizza in a little bit more detail, and you can divide this pizza based on the sectors from which the products are obtained, from which the goods and services are produced. So in general, we can have the primary sectors. The primary sectors refer to the agricultural sector in general, and also the mining sectors. The sectors that are based on the natural resources. And then that is the primary sector. And then the second one is the secondary sector. The secondary sector refers to the manufacturing industry. And then the third sector, which is the tertiary sector, refers to the services sector. So what happens in Indonesia over the last 3 decades or so, and especially in the last 20 years, so we experience what's so named deindustrialization. So what we mean by deindustrialization? It is a sign that the role of the industry, the role of the manufacturing industry in our economy is decreasing instead of increasing. Right? If I show you the data here, well, I used 2 indicators here to show my story, to support my story here. The first one is the industry, the value add that we gain from our manufacturing industry here, including construction. So if you look at here, so from 1919 to 2000 or so, here we experience an increase in the role of the industrial sectors in our economy, right? But then after that, it decreased here. It decreased very clearly here, right? So we experience the industrialization, the decrease in the share of the manufacturing industry in our economy. And okay, let me continue with this first. Right. So this data shows a little bit more detail about what happens. So first, as I mentioned before, we experience deindustrialization. Right. And the second one, within that deindustrialization, there is also another side, which is about the decrease in the role of the medium and high-tech manufacturing compared to other manufacturing industry sector, subsectors. So here we have, of course, we can have high-tech manufacturing industry, we can have medium-tech manufacturing industry, and then low-tech manufacturing industry. So what happens here, you can see in 1919 to 2000 something, then the trend is increasing, and then it continues to increase here, but then from here to there, the trend is decreasing. So what I'm saying is this, despite the relatively stable economic growth, that we achieved in the last 20 years or so, we experience a decrease in the quality of our growth. In the quality, in a sense that the contribution of the manufacturing sector, the contribution of the secondary sector is lower in our economy. All right, so we experience deindustrialization. Okay, if we look at the data here, this one is the data showing the share of employment by sector. Yeah, as I mentioned before, this can be seen as the primary sector, this can be seen as the secondary sectors, and this can be seen as the services sector, the tertiary sectors, right? So what happens? Yeah, the contribution of the manufacturing industry in terms of the share of the employment is relatively small. Yeah, it's relatively small, even though it does not seem to be increasing sharply. Yeah, decreasing sharply. I mean, but it is just a reflection. Yeah, it is just a reflection of another fact in our economy. Despite the relatively stable economic growth rate, we experience the low contribution of the manufacturing industry in terms of its share to the employment. Right. Of course, we hope that we can have higher share of the manufacturing industry in our employment in terms of the when we define the employment based on the sector. Okay, there are some economic theories explaining about this phenomenon, but in general, yeah, economists tend to agree that when we develop our economy, yeah, we should move from the primary sectors to the secondary sectors, and then as we have established our secondary sectors, we can move to the tertiary sector. So what happens in our economy in the last 20 years or so? Some of our economic activity, so the contribution of the manufacturing sector, the secondary sector, decrease. Some because we have moved our economy from the secondary sector to the tertiary sector. Well, that is not bad. That is not so bad actually, even though it is too early. Yeah, some of the economic activities have moved from the secondary sector to the tertiary sectors, to the services sectors. Yeah, it is not always bad, but what happens in Indonesia is that it happens too early. That's why I put this word premature there. What I mean by that, I will explain after this. Yeah. So usually when a country develop their economy, then they move from the primary sector to the secondary sector, and then they will develop their secondary sector, they will develop their industry, and they can gain as much benefit as possible from the sectors, and then they can increase their economy, they can increase their GDP per capita, they can increase the number of employment, they can increase many aspects of their economy from these sectors, and only after that, once they achieve higher level of economic welfare, then only after that they will move to the services sector. But what happens in our economy, and well, it is not only Indonesia, but also in some other developing countries as well. What happens in our economy is that we experience the industrialization that is too fast. We move from the primary sector to the secondary sector, but we have not exploited this sector as much as possible. Yeah, we have not achieved our largest benefit from this sector, but then we quickly move to the services sector. Right, so that is what happens. That's what happens now, and just a little bit worse. Yeah, just a little bit worse because some of the economic activities, instead of move to the service sector, instead of move to the tertiary sectors, some of our economic activities move back to the primary sector. All right, I think that is just a little bit worse because it means that we are to some extent, even though it is just to some small extent, we are going reverse rather than going forward to the tertiary sector. All right, why Indonesia has experienced this kind of premature deindustrialization? There are some explanations that have been given by economists. Some of the explanations are general in a sense that the explanation are relevant or are appropriate to the similar cases in different developing countries, including Indonesia. So one of the explanation is that there have been a change in the global economy where we rely more on technology, yeah, and where we have more open economies in the global context. Yeah, you know that in the last 20 years or so, there have been many progress in the, for example, trade agreements. Yeah, many countries agreed. Many countries sign like free trade area, regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, etc., etc. And as the global is more open, as the global economy is now more open, then it impacts, it brings effects to the economies of the developing countries, including Indonesia. And one of the consequences is the premature deindustrialization. How does it happen? Once again, you know that in the past, many developing countries, including Indonesia, actually, try to protect their local industry by giving some kind of facilities to the local industries. It might include subsidies to the local manufacturing industries. Yeah, it might include barriers for exports, for example, import tariff, import quotas, to reduce the import from other countries, so it can help the local producers, the domestic players, to grow, to develop their market in the domestic market. Yeah, so in the past that happens. Many countries employ protective policies in terms of the trade. So by having that protective policies, by having many protections, then they can help local industry to grow. But as we have more open economy, as we have free trade agreements, etc., then many countries, including Indonesia, are no longer able to have that kind of policies. And as we are no longer able to have that kind of policies, then the local players, the local industries, local firms, they cannot compete with firms or companies from other countries. And therefore, what happens? Indonesia, our market, our economy, has been flooded with products from other countries. And therefore, we move rather than what happens, rather than we have our manufacturing industry develop, what we have is just we move to the service sector by, for example, by being so rather than opening a company for manufacturing certain products, I would have a company, an importing company. So a company importing goods from other countries, and then I will sell it in our market in Indonesia. So what happens now, rather than contributing to the manufacturing industry, rather than contributing to the secondary sector, I'm contributing to the services sector. You know, one of the sector within that can be seen as the tertiary sector is the trade sector, and trade sector might include the activities of importing goods from other countries and then selling it in our domestic market. All right, so that's what happens. Yeah, go back to our main point. Yeah, despite our relatively stable economic growth rate before the crisis, before the COVID-19 crisis, we experienced a decline in the quality of our economy. We experience a decline in the structure of economy. So rather than having a structural transformation toward a stronger industrialization, what we have is a change in our economy, a transformation in our structure, structural transformation in our economy that going to the industrialization. Right, I will continue. What about now? Yeah, so what happens in the last 2 years? So you know that in the last 2 years we experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, just like Pakistan, just like many other countries. The COVID-19 pandemic that took place over the last 2 years has had a serious effect on Indonesian economy. So this is the illustration of what happens in our economy during the last 2 years. You see here we have real GDP and then real GDP growth rate. So just to be a little bit slow to help you to help those who do not come from economic discipline. So here we have a graph. Yeah, you look at the horizontal axis here. The horizontal axis is the time, the periods. So we have years. Here we have quarterly data. So basically 2017 quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4, 2018 quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4. And then what we have in this on this vertical axis here is the value of the real GDP. Yeah. So real GDP is the GDP that has been treated in a way that it does not contain inflation. It does not contain the change in the prices. Okay, and then here on the right hand side vertical axis, we have the percentage growth of the GDP, of the real GDP here. So what is the message here? If you look at these bars, yeah, we have these blue bars. These blue bars show the value of our real GDP, So it is in Indonesian rupiah. Yeah, you can see here basically. Well, there is a positive pattern here. I mean, there is a positive trend here. So in general, it is increasing actually. But of course, from period to period, it goes ups and down. Yeah. All right. So, but then in 2020 here, it tends to go down here. Even though here later in 2021 it goes up again. Okay, so that is in terms of the value. So now I'm going to talk about the growth rate of the real GDP. So this is the red one, yeah, this red curve. All right, as I mentioned before, the economic growth rate of Indonesia tends to be around 5%. Tends to be around 5%. And it is shown by this graph. It is shown by this curve here. Before the COVID-19, it is around 5%, not exactly 5%. But then, after that, it goes down here. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then after that, it goes up. Well, let me stop here a little bit, a moment. I understand that some of you, especially those who do not come from economics discipline, might need to think twice about this graph. So, as I mentioned before, the GDP, gross domestic product, reflects the total value of goods and services produced in a certain area, say in Indonesia, in a certain period, say in a year. So our previous data always show the data annually. So I mean, we are talking about the GDP produced from January to December, right? But actually, we can also present our data quarterly. So every 3 months, something like that. So the first quarter, or quarter 1, refers to January, February, March. The second quarter, April, May, June. Third quarter refers to July, August, September. The fourth quarter refers to October, November, December. So instead of calculating the GDP every year from this January to December, we can also calculating the GDP for every 3 months, for every quarter, right? So what we have in this graph, what I present in this graph is the data showing our GDP that are calculated every 3 months. So we call it quarterly GDP, right? Okay. So when we have the GDP, of course, we can calculate the economic growth rate, or we can calculate the real GDP growth. Let me repeat. Economic growth rate is equal to the real GDP growth. So when some economists talk about economic growth rate, something like that, then basically economic growth rate is just another name for real GDP growth, right? So when we have annual data, when we have GDP calculate from January to December, meaning we have annual GDP, then we can calculate the real GDP. We can calculate the economic growth rate from that value, right? So what we have is like annual percentage of the growth, right? But now, what if we calculate the GDP every 3 months? What if we have quarterly GDP? We can still have the economic growth rate, but with a little bit different calculation. So what we have here, yeah. All right. Let me make it. Let me do it a bit slower. I think based on usually it is useful for those who do not come from economics field. So economic growth rate is something like this. Economic growth rate. Economic growth is equal to the value at period t. Yeah. Mathematically it is calculated like this: minus the value at period t minus 1 divided by the value at period t minus 1 multiplied by 100. So this is the formula to calculate the economic growth rate. But in our case here, the value here refers to the gross domestic product, right? So if you have annual gross domestic product, so basically what you will have, for example, if you want to calculate the growth rate of the GDP in 2020, what we will do is to have the GDP in 2020 and in 2020 minus the real GDP in 2019 divided by the real GDP in 2019 multiplied by 100%. So that is, then you will, what you have is like annual percentage growth rate, something like that. So annual economic growth rate in percents, right? But now, as we have the real GDP calculate every 3 months, as we have quarterly GDP now, how do we calculate the GDP? Basically, there are several ways to calculate the GDP, but one of the way is to use this calculation, YOY. So what is YOY here? YOY refers to year on year. So what do you mean by year on year? Okay, let me explain. For example, the economic growth rate in this period. So if you can see, if you look at here, this one is very high, right? Economic growth rate. So how do you calculate? This is the economic growth rate of Indonesia in the second quarter of 2021. Yeah, second quarter of 2021. So how do you calculate that economic growth rate? So go back to this formula. So what you have here is the value of the GDP in the second quarter, yeah, in the second quarter of 2021. This one, yeah, this one. The value of the GDP in the second quarter of 2021 minus the value of the GDP in the same quarter a year before. Yeah, in the same quarter, but a year before, meaning the second quarter of 2020. Yeah, and then divide by the GDP in the still the same quarter, but last year, yeah, the second quarter of 2020. So you, once again, I repeat, the GDP in the second quarter of 2021 minus the GDP in the same quarter previous year, yeah, the second quarter to 2020 divided by the GDP in the second quarter 2020 multiplied by 100%. So if you do the calculation like that, then you will get the percentage growth of the GDP year on year, right? So basically you compare this one, right? Okay, just to give you an idea about what kind of calculation else that we have. The other one, we can have Q to Q, quarter to quarter. What that means? So if you find the data saying percentage growth Q to Q, quarter to quarter, that means that when you calculate the growth rate here, you compare the GDP in a certain quarter with the GDP in the exactly previous quarter. So when we are talking about the second quarter 2021, for example, then you compare the GDP when we are talking about the economic growth rate in the second quarter 2021, Q to Q, quarter to quarter, then we have the GDP in the second quarter 2021 minus the GDP in the first quarter of 2021 divided by the GDP in the first quarter 2021 multiplied by 100%. So basically, you compare the GDP in a certain quarter with the GDP exactly in the previous quarter. So then you will have quarter to quarter GDP. Quarter to quarter economic growth rate. But now our focus, my focus will be on the year-on-year economic growth rate. So what is the story here? So what is the story? So as we experience the COVID-19 pandemic, Indonesia officially has, so our first case of the COVID-19 pandemic took place in March 2020. So it was announced by our president, Joko Widodo, on the second day of March 2020. So he mentioned at the time that we have 2 cases of COVID-19. And then after that, the cases increase, the COVID-19 spreads, and then we enter the COVID-19 pandemic. So what happens with our economy? So before the COVID-19 pandemic, our economic growth rate year on year is around 5%, right? But then as we enter the COVID-19 pandemic, our economic growth rate decreased. In the first quarter of 2020, it decreased to 2.95%, just near to 3%. So usually it is around 5%, and then it decreased to around 3%. And then what happens in the second quarter of 2020? It goes very deep. It falls very deep here into minus 5.35%, 5 point something percent. Say, it goes, it falls very deep here, right? And then in the next quarter, which is the third quarter of 2020, we again experience negative economic growth rate, even though it is not as deep as the previous one. So here, our economic growth rate was around 3%, something, right? And then in the next quarter, which is the fourth quarter of 2020, we experience again negative economic growth rate, albeit not as deep as before, here. And then in the first quarter of 2021, again, we experienced negative economic growth rate around it, despite the fact that it was only minus 0.7%. So it's relatively shallow. And then in the second quarter of 2021, we experienced positive economic growth rate here. All right. So perhaps some of you have ever heard the term economic recession. Economic recession has been defined differently by different economists. But one of the most popular definition that has been used widely in the mass media, on newspapers, on the televisions, one of the definition is that recessions refer to the phenomenon of the negative economic growth rate for 2 periods or more, for at least 2 periods. So as we have negative economic growth rate here in the second semester of 2020, and then again negative economic growth here. So basically at the time, it has been said that we were officially in a recession, in economic recession, something like that. And then as we experience again negative economic growth here, then the economic recession continue, something like that. So that is the terms that have been used widely by the media. Wow, we are now in recession, something like that. Even though you need to be very careful, because this technical definition sometimes can be misleading. Especially this is the story that gave that misled people at the time. So as we experience negative economic growth rate in the last for several quarters, and then in the second quarter of 2021, we experience relatively high economic growth rate. It was 7 point something% here, 7 point something%. And then, as you remember the definition of economic recession refers to the situation where we have negative economic growth rate for 2 periods or more. But now we experience positive economic growth rate in this quarter. So what the newspaper said at the time, what the newspaper said, what the television news anchor mentioned about that. So they tend to say, wow, officially, goodbye the economic recession, something like that. So they tell the people, goodbye economic recession. Some even use I think like they glorify the story. They use the quite positive words. For example, one of the newspapers says something like that: new record. We have the highest economic growth rate since the last 17 years, something like that. So what is the impression that people get at the time? So those who do not understand economy, those who do not understand the economy, will think that, wow, we have a new achievement, something like that. Wow, it is a new record. Wow. And the impression was that, well, we are at the top of the world, something like that. Whereas the fact is that we were still in economic crisis at the time. Despite the fact that we have positive and relatively high economic growth here, but our economy remains in crisis. How to reconcile these two ideas? On the one hand, we have very high economic growth rate at the time, but on the other hand, we have the crisis, as I mentioned. This is the story, easy. One of the issues is that, remember, economic growth rate is calculated technically using the formula that I have mentioned before. So you can understand, if you compare the GDP in a certain quarter to the GDP in another quarter that is very low, the GDP, then you will gain very high value, right? Remember, what you do is to have this GDP minus the GDP in the same quarter previous year, last year, so which is this one. So what you do is to compare this bar, which is relatively high, with this bar. So as this bar was very low due to the crisis, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, then this bar seems to be very high compared to this one. And as you calculate the economic growth rate, then it gives the impression that our economy is at the top of the world, whereas in fact we were still in an economic crisis. All right, so that happens. That happens in the second quarter of 2021. At least we were no longer experiencing negative economic growth rate. And then in the third quarter, we have this economic growth rate which is a bit lower than this one. During this period here, we experienced the worst cases of COVID-19 pandemic. So the number of people infected at the time was the highest that we have during the COVID-19 pandemic. The number of people, the number of people passing away also was the highest in here. The ratio was the worst, right? And then after that, we go back to this one. We have lower economic growth rate, and this is the last available data that we have. So basically, that is what we have until the end of 2021. So just to give you more understanding of our economy, hopefully, I think I still have time. So I used to divide the economy. I used to divide the phases of the economy, the stages of the economy related to the COVID-19 pandemic into 3 stages. The first stage is the survival stage. What I mean by survival stage, the survival stage was the stage where we have to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, and what we can do is simply just to try to survive. Don't think about achieving something big. Don't think about achieving something glorious. Just think about how to survive, how not to get infected, how not to die. And in terms of the economy, how to have your business not closed, how to make sure that your business is not closed, how to make sure that your company is still running, something like that. So that is the first phase, the first stage, which is the survival stage. The second stage was the recovery stage. What I mean by recovery stage is a stage where we have been able to control our COVID-19 pandemic, and then we try to bring back our economy into the condition that we have achieved before the COVID-19 pandemic. It is just like you when you after you were sick, after you were sick, you have done with your illness, but then for example, you are still weak enough, you are not strong enough, so you have to eat much, and then to make sure that in a very short time you can be back to normal. So that is the recovery stage. And the third one is the regrowth stage. What is mean by the regrowth stage? I mean, the regrowth stage is the stage where you start to think about your new dream. You have been able to achieve your previous situation. You have been able to achieve the situation that is comparable to the one before the COVID-19 pandemic, and you start to have another dream for your future. So where Indonesia is now? To me, Indonesia is now in the second stage, which is the recovery stage. So in 2020, I would say that Indonesia was in survival stage. In 2021, I would say that Indonesia was in survival stage. But in this year, in 2020, I would say that Indonesia is in recovery stage. But of course, we are not in the regrowth stage. We are in the recovery stage. Now we are trying to bring back our economy into the one, into the condition that is comparable to the one before we have the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, if I go outside there, that's just the sign of what our economy look like. So when I go there, there are still shops that have not been reopened. So the shops were open before the COVID-19 pandemic, but then the COVID-19 pandemic, the shop have been shut, have been closed by the owners. I do not know for whatever reasons. But now some of them have been open, but many of them remain closed. So that is just a simple sign of the economy. And I would say that the economy has been fully recovered after I see those signs, after I see those we are close, sorry, temporarily we are closed, something like that is put on in front of the shop, something like that. Then once those signs have been taken, and once the shops have been operating in normal situation, then I would say that we are recovered already. I cannot say in exact when we are going to finish this recovery stage, but it could be at least 2 years, like this year and next year. Right. All right. Now, let me continue. So what about the future? So this is just an illustration of what will happen with our economy in the next year. So this is a projection that has been made by some major institutions. This one is made by the IMF. This one is from the World Bank. This one from the OECD, and this one from the Asian Development Banks. So based on their projection, our economy should grow positively in this year, in 2022, and in next year, 2023. So we expect that we can continue our recovery, and we can have better pizza. We can have larger pizza this year and next year. You remember, if we have positive economic growth rate, meaning that our pizza is getting larger. Even though our pizza is not as big as large as the one that we have before the COVID-19 pandemic yet. Okay. But unfortunately, this prediction has been made before the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So what happens due to the Russia-Ukraine crisis? So it is very likely that the prediction will go a bit lower, something like this. It will go a bit lower. So if it is mentioned here 5.2, for example, it is very likely that the prediction will be a bit lower. Actually, I think they have updated. Unfortunately, I have not been able to put it here. But the conclusion is, as I mentioned, they made the correction about their projection, and they say that our economic growth will be a bit lower than what they have said here, what I have cited here. All right, let me quick for the next slide, so we can have time for discussion. So if we look at the details of the economy during the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, one major point to make is that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has not been the same for every sectors, for every activities of the economy. For example, if you look at the expenditure components, we have this formula. Y is equal to C plus I plus G, and this one. Y is equal to, sorry, let me write it to help you. We have this formula. Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So the GDP is equal to consumption by household consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus export minus import, something like that. So what it said is this. So most of the components here has been decreasing during COVID-19 pandemic, except this one, which is government expenditure. Well, of course, it is quite normal. During the COVID-19 pandemic and during many other crises, the government has to play a larger role in the economy, and it happens in our economy as well. And in the last 2 years, and this year as well, 3 years, our government has experienced larger budget deficit. Why? Because they have to cover. They have to spend more to help the economy, and also their revenue has been decreasing. Why? Because our government's major revenue comes from the taxation, and you can imagine during the COVID-19 pandemic, the companies that need to be taxed, the people that are going to be taxed, they are in trouble, and therefore the tax that they pay is lower. Yeah, so the government revenue decrease, while at the same time government expenditure increase sharply. So what happens? We have larger deficit. Of course, the consequence is that in the last 3 years, our government budget, our government debt has increased very sharply. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, our government debt was around was just below 5,000 below 5,000 trillion rupiah. But now our debt has been increasing into 7,000 trillion rupiah. Yeah, so it is increasing like more than 2,000 trillion rupiah in the last 2 years, and that is very big. But to some extent, it can be understood as the money has been used to help the people, to help the economy, to keep growing, to keep moving. All right, and then if I continue just a little bit more. Yeah, if you look at the economy, sorry, I forgot to change this into English. But what is the main message here? My main message is simple. Yeah, the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy has been different for different sectors. And what sectors have been impacted mostly? These two. So this one is the hotels and restaurants. This one is the transportation logistics. You can see here it was deeply affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the transportation and logistics sector, and this one was the hotels and restaurant. And you can imagine these two sectors are quite related to the tourism, activities. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, the tourism activities have been severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. My final point, I think, for today's session, is that as the COVID-19 pandemic took place over the last 2 years and it impacts the economy, then it also brings an impact on our unemployment. So the number of unemployed people increased in the last 2 years. It is around 2,500 people. Yeah, 2,000. Sorry, I think I mistake. 2.5 million people has lost their job. Yeah, 2.5 million people have lost their job. 2.5 million from 2000. So our population is 275 million something. Yeah, and then 2.5 million people have lost their job. So basically, the number of unemployed people increase, and also our unemployment rate increase from this one 4.94% to 7.7%, 7.07%. In 2021, it is we have improved a little bit into this one, but still, in general, our unemployment rate relatively higher compared to the situation before the COVID-19 pandemic. And not only the number of unemployed people increase, but also the proportion of, but also the type of job they have. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, the ratio between the formal and informal job was like this. So this was the ratio before the COVID-19 pandemic. So what I'm saying is that the ratio of the people who work in the informal sector was only around 56 to 57%. But then, as we have COVID-19 pandemic, this ratio has increased. So 60% of the people are working in the informal sector. So what it means? It means that some people has lost their job in the formal sector, and in order to remain alive, in order to keep survive, in order to have their life continue, they have to work whatever work they can do, whatever job they can find. And this is what happens. They do whatever they do, and they move to the informal sector. I think that is it from me today. Hopefully it can be useful. Hopefully it can be understood by us here and can be. Okay, thank you very much.
All right,
Mr. Isaac.
All right, thank you, sir, for that presentation. It was very informative and got into great detail about the development of Indonesia's economy and sort of walking us through it using actual data and giving us the particular fact, figures, and stats, especially over the last 2 years, how the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of posed a great challenge to the real GDP growth of Indonesian economy. Also, taking care to explain, certain technical terms to the students in layman language. So thank you very much for that. Jazakallah, sir. We will now be moving on with the session. We have two Pakistani speakers who were also speakers with us in the previous sessions. We have Dr. Sajjad, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Peshawar. And we have Mr. Sulaiman Khan, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Geology, the University of Peshawar. So first, I'd like to invite Dr. Sajjad. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. How much time I have to speak? Do you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Okay, thank you. So for how much time I can speak?
Sir, take 15 minutes. Take 15 minutes
Okay.
of 15 to 20 minutes. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. There are something that I want to show. First of all, I appreciate the professor from Indonesia. He has spoken well and he explained very well the Indonesian economy and the development taking place over there. Let me share the. Can you see the slides now? The slides are visible
yes, sir.
now?
Very clear. Very clear, yeah.
Okay, okay, thank you. Basically, as this internship program is between a collaborative internship program between the Pakistani students, the Pakistani academia, and the Indonesian academia. And frankly speaking, this is my first time that I'm reading something about the Indonesian economy and the development experience, the development path that Indonesia experienced. And by reading about, by knowing about Indonesia, I just shocked that how much they had developed and how much they had overcome a lot of problems in their country. The most important problem that I think is that so many ethnic groups are there, more than 300 ethnic groups are there, and they are successful to manage all these ethnic groups and to bring a social cohesion in the country and to move on the path, move forward on the path of development. It's really difficult. Like here, if I compare it with Pakistan, so most of the time, very often, we have so many problems of ethno-linguistic fractionalization or ethno-linguistic conflicts over here. So we are very well aware of this sort of thing, that always, and there are a lot of studies about this thing, that if there are divisions in the society, so it is quite difficult for a country or for an economy to be developed. Here I want to bring into light, to bring into discussion some of the lessons that we can learn from Indonesia, and I think that our students may find it interesting, as well as thoughtful, as well as better for them to think about Pakistan and to develop some policies for Pakistan in future for the development of Pakistan. Okay, here are first of all, I will compare some of the socio-economic indicators, the development indicators of Pakistan and Indonesia, and we will see that how Pakistan is doing on the development front and how Indonesia had done on the development front. Here is a table. In this table, we can see some of the statistics that is showing the that is showing the performance or the status of Pakistan and Indonesia. If we see the if we see the GDP, so we can see that the Indonesian GDP is almost triple or more than triple of the GDP of Pakistan. GDP per capita of Indonesia is also almost triple as that of Pakistan. The GDP growth rate, as we can see, is also Indonesia is also ahead on that indicator, on that development indicator. And as the professor explained, that what we mean by GDP and what we mean by GDP economic and what we mean by economic growth and GDP per capita. I think there is no need to explain it further for the students who are not whose major is not economics, and I hope that they will understand the indicators that I'm showing over here. Similarly, there is only, I think, one indicator on which Indonesia is not doing very well, but I think, and that is the income inequality in Indonesia. And income inequality is usually, we can measure income inequality through Gini coefficient, and we can see that it is 37 in Indonesia, 37, and it is 29.6 in Pakistan. And the nearer it to G, the nearer it to 100, the nearer it to 100, the more inequality is there in a society, and the nearer it to 0, the more equal a society is. So on this front, I think Pakistan is doing well than Indonesia. But as we know that this is a well-known economic theory or economic thought that if a country is growing, so at the initial stages of growth, there will be some inequality. There will emerge some inequality in the society. So I think it's natural that inequality is increasing in Indonesia because it is growing and it is a growing economy. Similar is the case with other indicators, like we can see through which we can see the resource and income distribution in a society, like income share held by lowest 20%, income share held by middle 60%, income share held by highest 20%. So on all these fronts, we can see that inequality is high in Indonesia. Similar is the case with the life expectancy at birth. As far as the life expectancy at birth is concerned, so Indonesia is doing very well. 72 years, the people on average live 72 years in Indonesia, and in Pakistan it is 67 years. Maternal mortality ratio, which is another very important development indicator, which means that how many mothers die during the pregnancy and delivery related issues. So it is 177. It is 177 out of 100,000 in Indonesia, and it is 140 in Pakistan. So in this regard, I think Pakistan is doing well than Indonesia. But on other development indicators like mortality rate under 5, that how many kids die before the age of 5, so it is only 23 in Indonesia, and it is 65.2 out of 1,000 births in Pakistan. Poverty hit count ratio, as far as the poverty hit count ratio is concerned, so it is if we look at if we look at the $1.90 a day, it is 2.3% in Indonesia and 3.6% in Indonesia. But if we raise the threshold, or if we raise the poverty line from $1.90 a day to $5.50 a day, so it becomes 50.9% in Indonesia, and it becomes 77.6% in Pakistan. So it also shows that whenever we measure, whenever we estimate poverty, so it hugely depends upon the definition of poverty, that how we are going to define poverty. So similar is the case with, if we look at the poverty headcount ratio at the national lines. So Indonesia is doing well on that front. Also prevalence of stunting, that how many kids are stunted. So it is 30.8% in Indonesia and almost 37.6% in Pakistan. So we can see from this slide and from this data, these all data are from the World Bank World Development Indicators, and it shows that currently Indonesia is doing well than Pakistan. And in my view, there are certain reasons for this that we must look upon, that why we are lagging behind than Indonesia, and why Indonesia is doing much better than us. I think the first reason is that Indonesia is successful to control its population, because we know that, and we will also see in our next slides, that economic growth is equal to GDP growth minus population growth rate. So if our population growth rate is high, so our GDP per capita will be low. So here we can see the green bar is showing the population of Indonesia, and the yellow line is showing the population of Pakistan. But the absolute number of population of Indonesia is greater than us, but the growth rate of population in Indonesia, that is much lower than us. I think this is the okay. This is population living in slums. Similarly, I will come to that point later on, that population growth rate is low in Indonesia than in Pakistan. It is almost 1% in Indonesia and 2% in Pakistan. So the other fact is that rural population in Pakistan is much higher than Indonesia, which shows that Indonesia is going on the path of urbanization, and urbanization is also another very important determinant of development. Here we can see that more Pakistanis are living, as percentage of urban population are living in slums than in Indonesia. These are some basic information. Land area of Indonesia is greater than Pakistan. Population density, okay. The overall population of Indonesia is more than the Pakistani population, but we can see that the population density, which is people per square kilometer of land area, is low in Indonesia than Pakistan, which shows that the population pressure on the existing resources, on the carrying capacity of our country, is more is more in our country than in Indonesia. Here we can see the GDP, the GDP of Indonesia and Pakistan. So it is higher in Indonesia than Pakistan. GDP per capita is also high in Indonesia. Poverty, if we look at the poverty, so it is high in Pakistan than in Indonesia. These are again the same things. Now, why Indonesia is doing well than Pakistan on so many fronts? So here is the reason, I think. From this graph, we can also see that the trend of Indonesian GDP is upward sloping, which is being shown here from the green line. Then the Pakistani GDP per capita is also, or the Indonesian GDP per capita is also above of the Pakistani GDP per capita. The growth rate of Indonesia and Pakistan through history from 1960 to 2020 is not very much different. But so the question arises here that why then the GDP per capita of Indonesia is so much higher than Pakistan? So I think that the reason that I had earlier explained is that Indonesia managed to control its population than Pakistan, and we can see from this graph that the growth rate of Indonesia is downward, and it is lower than the Pakistani population growth rate, which is shown by the, I think, the yellow line, and the green line is showing the Indonesian population growth rate. Here I compared the population growth rate and the GDP growth rate of Indonesia, and we can see that the Indonesian population growth rate is just above zero, or we can say it is around 1%, and its GDP growth is almost most of the time above the population growth rate. So it had succeeded to increase its GDP per capita. Here we can see the Pakistan case, and the graph is showing the comparison between population growth rate of Pakistan and GDP growth rate of Pakistan. We can see that the population growth rate in Pakistan is above 2% most of the time. So that's why we failed to increase our GDP per capita as much as Indonesia succeeded to increase its GDP per capita. Now, here are some of the reasons that I think are important that why Indonesia is doing well on economic and on economic development and human development fronts. So I think the most important reason is the investment in people that is being done by Indonesia and Indonesia. By the Indonesian government. We can see that, and here are some of the proxies that I have to rely on to show that what is the status, how much Indonesia and Pakistan are investing in their people. Access to electricity in Pakistan, we can see that it is much lower than access to electricity in Indonesia. The green bar is showing the Indonesian people who can access to electricity. Similarly, the people using at least basic drinking water. So it is almost the same in both the countries. Even in this, on this indicator, Indonesia is better than Pakistan. It means that Indonesia is more concerned about about its people, about investing in the health and education and the human capital of its people. Now, another important indicator that shows the that how government or a country can invest in its people. So it is people using at least basic sanitation services. So we can see that the percentage of people who can use basic sanitation services in Indonesia are more than Pakistan. We will look a few more slides that will show some of the reasons, some of the very basic reasons that why the economic and human development in Indonesia is better than Pakistan. Here is another slide that is showing that shows the investment in people done by the governments of different countries, the governments of Pakistan and Indonesia. Human Development Index is an important indicator of development that shows human development, the status of human development in a country, and we can see that human development in Indonesia, which is being shown by the green bar, is higher than the human development in Pakistan. And the human development in Indonesia is almost above 0.7%. The value of human development. Basically, the Human Development Index value lies between 0 and 1. So the higher the value, the more human are developed, or the more human development in a country. The lower the value, the nearer to zero, the less or the least human are developed in a country. So we can see that the human development value in Indonesia is above 0.7, and it is 0.54 or 0.53 in Pakistan. And we can also see on the side of the slide that Pakistan stands at 154th position out of 189 countries on HDI, according to the Human Development Index, while the position of Indonesia is 107, which is not much impressive. But if we look at the developing countries like the South Asian countries, it is much better than Pakistan and the other South Asian countries. Similarly, the Human Capital Index, which shows the capital stock of health and education of the people in a country, is also good, better in Indonesia than Pakistan. Nowadays, the human capital concept is very much popular among the economists and the researchers, and they are of the view that investing in humans and building the human capital stock, enhancing the capacities and the capabilities of the productivity of humans is much important and is quite crucial for economic growth and development of the country. These are some of the slides, and these are some of the lessons that we can learn from Indonesia, that why they are doing so much better, despite the fact that they are also having such a diverse country. There are so many ethnic groups and so many regions in Indonesia, but they are successful to bring economic and human development in their country to a greater extent. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Suleiman, Professor Suleiman, you have the floor. Is Sir Suleiman here with us?
I think he is having some technical problems. I think he is not here. He's not around, I think. Dr. Suleiman.
All right, if he's not around, should we proceed to the question and answer session?
Yes, fine. I think ask the professor.
All right, then we'll begin our question and answer session. Students that have any questions, please raise your hands, introduce yourselves, and also specify whichever panelist your question is directed towards. And yeah, keep it short, mind your tones. Zulkifl Hassan, you may pose your question.
My question is for Sir Akbar. I wanted to ask, do you think that the green initiatives of Indonesian government may be useful for economic recovery?
Repeat your question, Zulkifl.
My question is for Sir Akbar. I wanted to ask, do you think that the green initiatives of Indonesian government may be useful for economic recovery?
Should I answer? Yeah, in the last 2 years, the government has attempted to get involved more in our economy. You know that first, as I mentioned before, the government increased their budget. Yeah, and among the budget was the budget used for what's your name Program Pemulihan Ekonomi Nasional, National Economic Recovery Program, something like that. And the budget was relatively big. In 2020, it was around 500 trillion rupiah. So it's around one fifth of our budget, our government budget at the time. And then in 2021, despite the initial decrease, so in the beginning, the government was, at the end of 2020, the government was quite optimistic that by 2021, COVID-19 pandemic done, something like that. We are optimistic this COVID-19 pandemic can be solved as soon as possible. It will be something like that. And then what happens at the time? They decrease the budget allocated for this into only around 300 trillion rupiah. So it's like just around like 3/4 of the initial budget. But then they realized that it was a mistake, yeah, because the COVID-19 pandemic were getting worse in 2021, and then they revised the budget and re-increased the allocation for the budget allocation for the National Economic Recovery Program, which include the budget for the for dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. They increased into 700 million rupiah, which is around 1/3 of the total budget, yeah, at the time. And this include many aspects of the this budget include many different programs, which include among others some safety net programs for the people affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, poor people, and then those who lost their job, etc., etc. And then also the budget also include some budget for the small and medium enterprises, giving subsidy for them, giving subsidies for them, giving different kind of facilities. And then also the budget was allocated for some other programs, including for helping the banks to have proper liquidity to run their business, etc., etc. Okay, but it was not quite explicitly mentioned about the initiative related to the environment. And even frankly speaking, I did not hear anything specific about, for example, the environment program during the COVID-19 pandemic. Perhaps because our attention was not really about this issue. Our attention was really about the health of the people, about the safety of the people, about how we can help those who lost their job, about how we can help those who are poor and cannot meet their living, something like that. So green initiative was not part of the issue in this kind of discussion. But of course, if we are talking about the our development in general, if we are talking about our economy in general, green initiative is of course an issue. And to my understanding, I'm not an expert in this field at all, but to my understanding, the government has allocated some funds, also creating some fund design to help initiate programs that are more environmental friendly. For example, with respect to the effort to move our fuels from oils to more renewable resources, to fuels that are to fuels that are based on renewable resources. I think that's it.
Thanks, sir. I have another question. Indonesia has been a member of G20 for some time, and right now it holds the presidency of G20. How helpful can it be for stabilizing the Indonesian economy post-COVID-19? Okay.
Well, it is an interesting question. Yes, Indonesia is now holding the presidency of the G20. What is G20? G20 is an organization whose members are the 20 largest economies in the world. Well, not exactly the largest, but around the largest economies in the world. And and as we are now holding this presidency, now we have we are organizing many events in our country related to the G20, including official meetings, ministerial meetings, etc., etc. And of course, this increased the number of economic activities in our economy. As we have meetings, of course, people from the country come to our country. They bring their money, and you can imagine them you can think of them like you think about tourists who come to Indonesia. They come, they bring money, and then we have the events, and of course, transactions happen, etc. And it helps our economy. But to what extent? Well, frankly speaking, I cannot give you an exact number about how big this, but of course it is helpful. Just one question, just one point. Hopefully, just hopefully, it will not be a big issue later when we are talking about the presence of President Putin. You know that President Putin wants to come, whereas at the same time other countries, they do not want to come. They say that, well, we don't want Putin to come here. Hopefully it will not affect our position, of course, but it is beyond my topic today.
All right, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Dr. Faisal Khan, you may pose your question. Faisal Khan, your hand is up. Oh, yeah.
Sir, I have a question that, as per my information, the Central Bank of Indonesia is independent, while the Central Bank in Pakistan is not yet independent. So what is the role of the independent central bank in the economy? And the second one, Dr. Sajjad sir present the comparative study, and where I found that most of the economic indicator, almost all of the economic indicator of the Indonesia is far better than the Pakistan. But when I checked the currency rate, one Pakistani rupee is equal to 79.5 Indonesian rupiah. So if the economic indicators are very good, then why Indonesian currency is that much depreciated or devalued?
Well, interesting question. Well, okay. So yes, our central bank is independent. Yeah, well, quote unquote, because, well, it depends on how you explain the independency, right? But one way we explain our independence is that the central bank is led by some, we call it board of governors. Yeah, board of governors, and the board of governors are not under the president. They are not member of the cabinet. Yeah, the board of the governors of the Central Bank of Indonesia are elected by the parliament. So basically, technically, it is done like this. So our president, they will choose someone as the candidate, 1 or 2 or 3 candidate, and then the president will send the name to the parliament, and then the parliament will elect the one that they want. Sometimes it happens that the president only send one name. In that case, that's fine. But the parliament can say, no, we do not want this candidate, something like that. And that happens in the past. Yeah. And then if the parliament agree with the candidate, then that person can be sworn in as the governor of the central bank, or the vice governor of the central banks, or the deputy governor of the central bank. So the board of the governors consists of the governor, vice governor, and the deputy governors. So they are independent in the sense that they cannot be pushed by the government. They cannot be pushed by the president. So they can have different opinion from the one by the president or the ministers. Yeah. So the minister cannot say, "Hey, follow me," something like that. No, they are independent, because even if they have different opinion with the president cannot sack them, cannot fire them. Yeah. Once they are elected and they are sworn, then they are independent. No one can interfere them, including the president. Theoretically. Yeah, theoretically. Of course, in as a matter of fact, sometimes it happens that the governor of the central bank will have some meeting with the ministers. They can discuss topics. They can discuss issues. They can agree on many issues, and they can agree about what the government need to do, something like that. But by the law, yeah, the ministers and even the president are not allowed to push them to follow what they want. Yeah. So that is what we mean by independent central bank. To what extent does this independency help our economy? Well, that is a very big debate, and it is not easy, of course, to give the evidence. And I think one of the questions is just as you raised, yeah, why our currency tends to be weak, yeah, why it tends to depreciate very much in the last few years, for example. Is it really because of their independence? But I think it is not. It is not really about their independence, but it is, the extent of the currency is not independent of the economic situation. It's not independent of the economy in general. Yeah, when our export in the last few years, no, I think in the last 10 years or so, our export has been weaker. Yeah, has been weaker. Yeah, our export has been weaker. Our import has been increasing, and in general, before the COVID-19 pandemic, we tend to have a deficit in terms of the international trade. Yeah, in terms of the international trade. So perhaps that might explain about why our currency tends to depreciate. But I think you will meet you will have a special session about that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Sir Sajjad, if you'd like to answer the question.
Which question? I think
I believe
the professor answered very well all the questions. So I think there is no need to further comment on that. It's quite clear.
All right, but it was posed to you. Anyhow, moving on. Wagma Ataullah, please ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. My name is Wagma Ataullah and I'm from Department of International Relations. My question is for Professor Akbar. Sir, as you mentioned the role of Indonesian government in boosting economy of Indonesia, what do you think is the role of those international organizations or regional organizations of which Indonesia is a member? Are they playing any role in Indonesian economy?
Well, if what you mean by role is that they can affect us, yeah. Let's look at this a little bit more detail. Yeah, when the organization that you say is something like is the one like IMF or the World Bank, then well, in the past IMF has had strong role in our economy, especially after we have the 1997-1998 financial crisis at the time. So Indonesia, after having that crisis at the time, we were involved in a debt, in a debt to the IMF. And as part of the debt, as part of the agreement with the IMF at the time to get the debt to help us recover our economy at the time, we have to follow some of the their prescription, something like that. And it was mentioned in our letter of intent, LOE, letter of intent. So our government says that, okay, please help us, and we will do this, we will do this, we will do this, we will do this by this time, by this time, by this time, at a time. Right? But later, it has been a controversial issue, and you know that economists have been. Some economists say that the prescription from the IMF have been too far, and in fact, it was failed to some extent. And some will say that, oh, the IMF have interfered too far to our economy, and their prescription was wrong, something like that. But some other people will say that, well, the prescription from the IMF was just normal. That is part of the agreement, something like that. But it was interesting that one day the IMF said that we are sorry that some of our advice was not correct, something like that. That is a fact at the time. I think sometime between 2000 and 2010 at the time. What about World Bank? The World Bank, our interaction with the World Bank, Indonesia is a member of the World Bank, and of course, World Bank has some policies that to some extent affect us, especially when Indonesia, as a developing country, you know, the World Bank provide us with some loans, yeah, and also some grants. And as a part of that loan, as part of those grants, then they will require some things that we have to follow. And some will say, most economists will say that, okay, that's fine, yeah, as long as they do not interfere too far. But some economists will look at this issue as something that is crucial. They say that we have to follow like neoliberal policy, something like that, and well, it is not quite fit with our economy. Indonesia should have its own policy. We should be independent of the World Bank, etc., etc. Now, what about the G20, for example, the international organization like G20? I think the G20 is less. It has less impact or less effect on our economy. It is an organization that is more of like, we try to meet other leaders from other countries, and then we try to solve any issue together. But it does not really have a power to push something to our economy. Well, G20, for example, and then what other organization? I think the one that is most that has some impact is WTO. But I'm not an expert in that field. As you know, the WTO has an objective to promote free trade. And as part of our membership there, then we have to follow the agreements there under the WTO. And it has impact on our economy, as I mentioned before. For example, with respect to our policy, as we are no longer have the ability to to close our market from the overseas, yeah, and we cannot protect our local producer, local domestic producer, etc., etc. Yeah, I think that's it.
Right, thank you, sir. Any students that have a question, please raise your hands. Mr. Awais Danish, you may present your question.
Hi, my question is for Sir Akbar. How can policymakers of Indonesia overcome the middle income trap?
Well, yes, that is a good question. You know, we were in up to 2011, Indonesia was still low-income countries. Yeah, and then from 2012, we start to be part of the lower middle-income countries. You know that there are four classification, four groups of countries based on the World Bank classification: low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and then high-income countries. So basically, from 2012, we enter the middle-income status. In 2019, we were almost going from lower middle countries to the upper middle countries, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we fall down again. We fall down again. Instead of going to the upper middle countries, we go back to the lower middle countries. And yeah, and it is an issue how we can move from the low middle income country status to the high income countries. And I think it is an issue that is relevant to many countries, including to Indonesia. And I think we are still far away from that. Previously, like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we talk about the demographic bonus. We expect that by having this demographic bonus, we can help us. It can help us to increase our productivity. It can help us to fasten our economic growth rate. It can help us to quickly increase our GDP per capita. But unfortunately, I think we have not been successful to do that. Yeah, and especially in the last 2 years, as we have COVID-19 pandemic, not many people talk about the middle income trap. Not so many people talk about the demographic bonus. We all busy with the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we have very big challenge with respect to this issue. I think Professor Sajjad perhaps can explain in the context of Pakistan, but we do have big challenge with respect to this issue. How we can move from the middle income to the high income countries. I think we are still far away from that.
All right, thank you. Are there any more questions? Students, if you have questions, please raise your hands. All right, as one of the speakers is not present, I think we're free before the scheduled time. There are no questions, right? Can we conclude the question answer session? I'll ask again, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Yeah, I think we don't have any more questions. That's all right. We'll conclude the session. All right, then that concludes our session for today. Thank you to everyone that joined. Thank you to the honorable guest speakers, and thank you to all the students. I hope everyone got something to learn today. Someone raising their hand? Anyhow,
Okay.
we will meet again.
I'm sharing my presentation through the chat box.
Oh, you're giving the link? Sure, thank you. Sure, just drop the link in the chat box, yeah.
Yeah, in the chat box.
This will later be shared in the group so students can. Let's just wait for Sir's link, then we can.
No, it is just the presentation that I had.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, that's it then. Students, we will meet again on the 19th of April. Until then, take care and Allah Hafiz. You may all now leave the session. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Pak Akbar. Thank you.
Terima kasih, Pak.
Sama-sama.